Tune in every Tuesday for High Society with your host, David Malmo-Levine, here on Pot TV. Hello, and welcome to another edition of High Society. My name is David Malmo-Levine, and on this week's show, I'm going to read to you my Supreme Court speech. Or the latest version of it. I cut this down from about 120 minutes and 33 pages yesterday. We're gonna save you that version. It's now down to 24 pages. It'll probably have to get cut some more before I deliver it to the Supreme Court. But this is what I've got going so far. My name is David Malmo-Levine. I'm not a lawyer. I am, however, a cannabis user and cannabis researcher, and I'd like to once again be a cannabis merchant. I feel I can dispel some myths regarding cannabis-induced impairment, brain damage, amotivation syndrome, asocial behavior, and such by my choice to appear before you self-represented and self-medicated. I've received advice from the lawyers in the other cases here today. Mr. Conroy advised me to loosely base this speech on my written legal arguments, but also to speak from the heart about liberty, equality, autonomy, and dignity. Professor Young and Mr. Bernstein told me to focus on what the court can do, not what it should do. Keeping all that in mind, I wish to discuss the meaning of life, liberty, and security found in Section 7, the harm principle, the burden of proof, harm reduction, and a few other legal arguments that pertain to the right to grow and deal cannabis. After that, I will explore equality in Section 15, respond to the Crown's factum, and then conclude. But before I enter into the argument, a bit of background to explain how I got here. I began smoking pot in 1985. I was 14 years old. For me, it acted as an anti-stress, anti-depression, anti-fatigue, anti-insomnia, pro-appetite or preventative medicine, and a time-slowing, focusing, inspiring, or performance-enhancing medicine. It also had expectorant properties. Although I didn't really see it as self-medicating at first, that's exactly what I was doing. Those were the effects cannabis consistently had on me and continue to have on me. Even the dictionary definition of the word recreation involves health. Taber's Cyclopedic Medical Dictionary says of recreation, quote, an endeavor that refreshes, provides mental or physical relaxation, or both. Webster says recreation means, quote, restoration to health, unquote. According to a 1997 Angus Reid poll, 83% of Canadians approve of cannabis when used for health reasons. In my submission, refreshment and relaxation are health reasons. My regular cannabis use did not interfere with being gainfully employed. While living in Edmonton, I worked for 2 years as a drugstore clerk, delivering synthetic medicine to the homebound, while selling tobacco, coffee, pop, chocolate, and sugar to the unstimulated. I worked at Tim Hortons, again selling coffee, pop, chocolate, and sugar. For a time, I was a hospital security guard, making sure the alcoholics didn't run off for a drink as they took their bi-hourly smoke breaks. I even worked as a recreational therapist at the Edmonton Young Offender Center. Mislabeled corrections, it is at best warehousing, or more realistically, a crime school and a torture chamber for poor and Aboriginal youth. In my submission, anyone stuck in any one of these dull or disturbing jobs has a legitimate reason to self-medicate for stress, depression, and fatigue. Many people would prefer to be growing, breeding, and selling beautiful-looking and beautiful-smelling dried flowers to what the rest of the job market has to offer. In 1990, I visited Holland to see firsthand the fabled coffee shops, places where open cannabis and hashish sales are tolerated. As I floated around Amsterdam, searching in vain for the mayhem and social decay that some still argue would result from an open cannabis market, it dawned on me. Canadians were very much like the Dutch, tolerant, freedom-loving, productive, and autonomous. I remember thinking to myself, if the Dutch can handle this much freedom, why can't we? In 1993, I joined with dozens of activists across the country, using flagrant violations of the law to teach hemp history and call attention to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, then known as Bill C-7, which adjusted Canadian cannabis law to allow for mass arrests. In 1995, my skills came to the attention of Mark Emery and other cannabis activists, and I was flown out from Edmonton to Vancouver to work full-time to re-legalize cannabis. By September of 1996, Proposition 215 was about to be voted on in California, and anything seemed possible. On October 19, 1996, I co-founded the Harm Reduction Club, a direct-action cannabis re-legalization organization that demonstrated how simple it is to distribute recreational or so-called non-medicinal cannabis and to deal it properly. Membership required a pledge not to drive impaired and requested members read the Safer, Smarter Smoking Guide. I sold the herb out of my basement apartment. All the neighbors immediately signed up. On December 4th, 1996, the police raided the Harm Reduction Club at gunpoint and seized 316 grams of cannabis bud. I was charged with a possession of marijuana charge for the purpose of trafficking, contrary to Section 4 of the Narcotic Control Act. By that time, the club had grown to about 700 members. Constable S. Dion, tendered by the Crown as an expert on cannabis trafficking, confirmed that, to some extent, the club offered methods to reduce the harm from any marijuana use, and that the club was a consumer-oriented venture, following a well-established cultural tradition allowing the use of marijuana. Further, testimony from the applicant's mother and father and apartment manager demonstrated neighborhood, community, and multi-generational support for the club. Finally, it is important to note that the club's membership card specified that members pledged not to drive while impaired, not merely while under the influence. The distinction was made to address valid community concerns while avoiding possible discriminatory practices, like, for example, harassment of non-impaired drivers who happen to be high on cannabis. In my trial, I introduced terms familiar to some drug counselors and young pot activists, but unfamiliar to police, doctors, Crown prosecutors, and most researchers. For example, harm reduction means education, quality control, and a safe point of sale. Education means teaching about the hazards of prohibition, but also about proper dosages and other smarter smoking methods. Smarter smoking means focusing on the following factors: dose, mindset, setting, strain, quality, potency, smoke cooling, clean ignition, and clean mode of administration. We taught users how to look for signs of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, or mold, or other contaminants that may cause respiratory illness. But enough about motivation. Now, to demonstrate some focus, the legal argument. Section 7 states, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. The harm principle was found to be a principle of fundamental justice in the court below. In the words of Justice Braidwood, you don't go to jail unless there is a potential your activities will cause harm to others. Justice Braidwood specified harm to others instead of just harming ourselves, recognizing that true freedom requires the right to risk harm to ourselves. Autonomy, the right to take risks with our own lives, is protected more clearly by Justice LaForest in B(R) versus Children's Aid Society. When she was speaking for the majority, she wrote, "The individual must be left room for personal autonomy to live his or her own life and to make decisions that are of fundamental personal importance." Unfortunately, too much emphasis has been placed upon the fundamental personal importance part of that decision, and not enough attention has been placed upon the own life part. In my submission, we need to be making as many decisions about our own lives as possible, not as few as necessary. Perhaps we should be making all the decisions concerning our own lives, if they truly are our lives. In On Liberty, the most obvious source of our Constitution's political freedoms, John Stuart Mill reveals the reason to protect the other than political freedom component of freedom, the liberty of tastes and pursuits. The mental muscles, he writes, need exercise. We would become sheep if we left decision-making all up to the governments. The question then arises, do we have the right to hurt others from our impaired driving or burden others through healthcare costs with our sickness from cannabis abuse? The answer is that we do not have the right to put others at risk by driving while impaired on cannabis. But we do, however, have the right to risk harm to ourselves, whatever that harm may be. Just as importantly, and more on topic, we have the right to act in ways that we feel are practically harmless to ourselves or slightly risky to ourselves, despite our government feeling otherwise. After reading the Canadian Civil Liberties Association's factum, I have an additional submission to add. The government should never, ever be able to throw you in jail simply for your own good, no matter how serious the risk of harm or inherent harm to yourself. According to Mill, the government can do many things with the self-abusers to make him stop, such as remonstrating with him, or reasoning with him, or persuading him, or entreating him, but not for compelling him or visiting him with any evil in case he do otherwise. In my submission, the government is justified if someone is driving erratically or acting impaired at a heavy machinery or a security-sensitive job. They're justified in testing those people for impairment. The government is not justified in making us eat, drink, dress, play, love, medicate, fornicate, procreate, recreate, decorate, read, watch, listen, or act, live or die in any particular way for our own good. Legal paternalism, unlike the harm principle, is not a principle of fundamental justice. This immediately begs the question. When testing the constitutionality of laws using the harm principle found in Section 7, is the test, you don't go to jail unless the state has proved that there is a probability the contested activities will inherently cause harm to others, even if done properly? Or is the test, you don't go to jail if you yourself can prove that there is a probability that the contested activities won't cause harm to others, even if done properly? In other words, where does the burden of proof truly lie when the harm principle comes into effect? Does it lie with the consistently resourceful state or with the often resourceless criminals and scapegoats?